Hello everyone, I'm Michael. In this video I want to talk about the Legend of Zelda timeline, particularly in how it can be deduced by only looking at the games themselves. This is to say, I'm not going to be looking at any of the interviews or guidebooks or the later books such as Hyrule Historia or the Encyclopedia. Now, with that being said, I am going to be including the game boxes as well as the manuals, since many of the developers would put a lot of the story in the manuals or sometimes even on the game box to tell the story that the games maybe couldn't back then. And especially in the Legend of Zelda's case, it quite literally tells the player to look up the manual for more details. Real quick, however, I wanted to go over what a timeline is as it pertains to a franchise like the Legend of Zelda. When it comes to fictional stories, when you have one story that is then continued or preceded by another story, you can place those games or stories in a sequence of events that comes together to make a timeline. In the real world, we would call this history, and you can look back through time and see all the different historical documents, many different battles or events that happened in the past that shaped our world as it is today. And many times in the past, there can be events that aren't really connected to each other, such as the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, or the reign of Oda Nobunaga and then his subsequent downfall. Now, there are certain events that will lead to one another, such as the events that led up to World War I or World War II. You can see a chronological order of events that directly influence one another, but sometimes in our real world, many stories exist that don't follow a sort of narrative, if you could call it. Now, some have called the Legend of Zelda series timeline complicated or too complex, but I believe it's mainly just because the series was released out of chronological order, but Zelda is far from the only story to have done so. Star Wars, George Lucas's Star Wars, for example, was certainly released out of order. Originally, George had a story of just one story, and it was going to be from the beginning with Anakin, his turn to the dark side, and then his redemption at the end. But he wasn't particularly too fond, I believe, of starting at the beginning of a story, and he wanted to just jump straight into the middle of it, which is what he did with the original story that then continued into Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. Those were considered episodes 4, 5, and 6. Later, when he felt that the story of Vader wasn't fully understood, he went back and did episodes 1, 2, and 3, and so he had a full 6-film saga. But even then, he would later do the Clone Wars, in which that would fill in the time between episodes 2 and episodes 3. And the Clone Wars is certainly released wildly out of order as well. So I certainly don't think that The Legend of Zelda being released out of chronological order means that it's too complex or too difficult to understand. If you watch Star Wars, George Lucas's Star Wars, in chronological order, with episodes 1 and 2, then the entirety of the Clone Wars in chronological order, then go to episode 3, then episode 4, 5, and 6. You can see it's a pretty smooth, easy to understand narrative, but I can understand if you watch them all in release order, it could be a bit jumbled up, difficult to follow the narrative there, for some maybe. Now on to the Legend of Zelda series. The first game in the series, The Legend of Zelda, was the first game, so of course it has no narrative to adhere to. It established the franchise. It established certain key elements such as Link, Zelda, Ganon, and the Triforces of power and wisdom. It also introduced things such as the world of Hyrule, certain races like the Zora or Octoroks, and a plethora of other things, locations like the Lost Woods, Death Mountain, etc. Next would be Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, which is stated to have taken place a few years after Zelda 1, after Link had defeated Ganon and is attempting to help rebuild Hyrule. This game introduced a lot of different elements in its backstory, such as showcasing how Hyrule was once one full kingdom. In Zelda 1 and 2, the present day is called a Little Kingdom. So in the past, it was one kingdom, and it showcased how the King of Hyrule back then utilized the Triforce to maintain peace, and there's a whole additional backstories there. Next is A Link to the Past, and that game takes place much further back in the past than the original Zelda game did, and it's stated on both the English and Japanese boxes that this is the case. Now, you can also deduce elements of it in the actual game itself, such as the fact that Hyrule is one full kingdom, unlike how it's described in 1 and 2, where it's just a little kingdom. A Link to the Past also introduces certain elements, such as the fact that Ganon used to be a human named Ganondorf before he went into the Sacred Realm and stole the Triforce. That subsequently turned into the Dark World, and he became the beast known as Ganon that is later seen in the first Zelda game. It also introduced the 7 sages, mistranslated in the English versions as 7 wise men, One of the other major elements of this game's story is the Hylia bloodline is thinning, which means the magical powers that the Hylians used to have are much more rare and are really relegated to just a few families. One of them is Link's family, which can be traced back to the Knights of Hyrule. Another big element of A Link to the Past's backstory is the Imprisoning War, which detailed after Ganon had gotten into the Sacred Realm, turned it into the Dark World, and utilized the power of the Triforce. Many monsters begin to flow out of the Dark World and into the Light World of Hyrule. Back in the past, it's stated that the King of Hyrule had summoned the 7 sages to make a seal over the Dark World so that no more monsters could flow through, and that the Knights of Hyrule were stated to have mostly perished in the battle defending the sages. A Link to the Past also has a big backstory involving the 3 goddesses that created the world of Hyrule, as well as all the denizens and life that live in the world. It also shows how they left behind the Triforce. A Link to the Past also introduces a key element of the series, which is the Master Sword, and it shows that its resting place would be in the Lost Woods. The original English manual of the game erroneously states that the Master Sword was not created until after the Imprisoning War. The original Japanese manual implies that it was already created and just utilized after that point. Next is Link's Awakening, which takes place sometime after A Link to the Past, after that Link became the legendary hero and defeated Ganon. Link hears the concerns of the people of Hyrule, that they fear what could come from Ganon's ashes, and because he's a hero, he goes off to train to help himself become stronger. Now, after his training quest, he is tempted to come back to Hyrule, but crashes his ship. After his crash, he wakes up on Koholint Island and is first greeted by Marin. Another element that indicates this is the same Link from A Link to the Past is that you can read a book that indicates that the spin attack was created by the family of the hero, which is noted in A Link to the Past to be the Knights of Hyrule. Next is Ocarina of Time. Now this game takes place further back in the past than even A Link to the Past was, and you can tell that because you meet the 7 sages which were mentioned in A Link to the Past. You also will eventually see how Ganondorf the human would become Ganon the Beast. Ocarina of Time shows a further expanded version of the backstory of the 3 goddesses creating the world of Hyrule that was first mentioned in A Link to the Past. The ending of Ocarina of Time details Link defeating Ganon and Zelda along with the other sages sealing him in the Sacred World, known in this game as the Evil World, which we know would become the Dark World in A Link to the Past. Now, there's some discrepancies here. For one, in A Link to the Past, it stated that Ganon had the entirety of the Triforce with him when he was stuck in the Dark World, whereas in Ocarina of Time, he only has the Triforce of Power when he's sealed in the Evil Realm. And so that doesn't line up perfectly, but still seems to be the same story, so perhaps Ocarina of Time was introducing some retcons. Ocarina of Time's ending is then shown to be split between 2 separate timelines, one that follows after Zelda sends Link back in time, which would continue to show the world of Hyrule celebrating Ganondorf's defeat and the other 7 sages, and so that world would go on to exist without the Link, the hero of time, that saved them. The other ending shows Link's perspective when Zelda sent him back in time, and he returns the Master Sword, and he returns with the Triforce of Courage on his hand, and he goes to warn Zelda about Ganondorf's future plot. These 2 different endings to Ocarina of Time are known as the Child Timeline and the Adult Timeline. Next up is Majora's Mask, and this game takes place a few months after Ocarina of Time. We know this because the very opening of the game recaps Ocarina of Time. There's other hints such as the Skull Kid recognizing Link in the opening of the game, Link recalling the Song of Storms, and some other details. The next games are the Oracle of Ages and the Oracle of Seasons. Now these games are the first ones that don't have an explicitly definable timeline placement, but there are a few hints. One is the fact that the Triforce is tucked away in Hyrule Castle. The second is the fact that Ganon is dead, like completely killed to the point where he needs to be revived through the Gerudo Witch's Twinrova, using their magic to revive him with a sacrifice. So at this point, the only times when Ganondorf is dead, completely dead, and not just sealed away like he was in the ending of Ocarina of Time, would be after Adventure of Link or A Link to the Past. So even though this one doesn't have an explicit timeline placement, it's really just after one of 2 games, A Link to the Past or Adventure of Link. Next is 4 Swords, and this game really doesn't have much at all in terms of timeline placement. All we can really see is that the stories of like Ganondorf, the Master Sword, and the Triforce aren't involved in it, but I guess it's not too much to really go off of. It's really about the story of Vati, the Wind Sorcerer, and him kidnapping maidens in the past, and him being sealed away by a hero who sealed him in the 4 Swords. but other than that there's no real placement to put it in. Next is the Wind Waker, and it's pretty clear, like Majora's Mask, where it goes. It's after Ocarina of Time, but on the adult timeline, the story of the hero of time is constantly referred back to. It's after Zelda and the sages sealed Ganon away and Link was sent back. It's following from their perspective, where eventually Ganon will break free from that seal and the people of Hyrule will pray to the gods and the world is flooded, etc. It's fairly obvious. Now at this point I also want to point out that A Link to the Past was ported to the Game Boy Advance, and it had made some changes and amendments to its lore to accommodate for Ocarina of Time. The entire backstory of Ganondorf going into the Sacred Realm, stealing the Triforce, and turning it into the Dark World, and then the imprisoning war ensues afterwards. These details are pretty much completely erased from the backstory seen in the manual of the Game Boy Advance version, likely due to the fact that it doesn't fall in line with what Ocarina of Time now shows, of how Ganon touched the Triforce, turned the Sacred Realm into the Evil Realm, and then was later sealed into the Evil Realm. Next is Four Swords Adventures, and this game, like the Oracle games, is a bit more ambiguous in its timeline placement, though there are some hints of where it has to go and cannot go. One, it's after Four Swords, so the entire backstory of Four Swords Adventures recaps the first Four Swords game, but it also has to be after Ocarina of Time because that was the first game to chronologically show Ganondorf, who then later becomes Ganon. This iteration of Ganon in Four Swords Adventures is one noted to be separate from the one seen in Ocarina of Time, as he's noted to be the Demon King Reborn. We also hear about his backstory growing up in the Gerudo, and him leaving there, stealing the Trident, then becoming Ganon. So we know that this Ganon has to be a separate one and takes place after Ocarina of Time in order for him to be the Demon Reborn. So we know that it's after Four Swords as well as after Ocarina of Time, but beyond that there's not too much to know precisely where it could fit in. Next is Minish Cap, and we know that this is the first game in the Four Sword saga, as we quite literally see the Four Sword being forged for the first time, as well as the origins of Vati. So we know that this game, Four Swords and Four Swords Adventures, creates one single story in a trilogy of games. Now, again, we don't know precisely where the game could fit exactly. All we really know is that this game precedes Four Swords, then Four Swords is after it, then sometime Ocarina of Time happens, and then Four Swords Adventures is sometime after that. Next is Twilight Princess, and this game takes place on the child timeline after both Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. In the game there's a scene where Ganondorf is being executed for his crimes that we know that Link told Zelda of in Ocarina of Time when he came back in time, so we can assume that due to what Link was able to tell them there, that it led to his execution seen in Twilight Princess. We also see things like the fisherman from Ocarina of Time being noted to have lived in a previous era, with Hina then making a comment or perhaps joke that she's a descendant of said fisherman. And there's other details such as the hero spirit that appears also as the golden wolf that teaches you all of your different moves is assumed to be the hero from Ocarina of Time. There's many hints that he's the hero of time, such as the fact that he has the Master Sword's sheath, and the fact that he makes mention of his bloodline and the hero's bloodline, and makes mention that this Link is a descendant of him. When Ordana gives Link the green tunic, it's made note that that's the clothes of the hero that saved Hyrule once before. One of the Zoras makes mention of the hero of the past, specifically implying that the blue tunic of the Zoras is the same one that Link wore in Ocarina of Time, or at least the implication that it's at the very least evoking the same imagery as the hero told in the history of the Zora, which on that note implies that the story of the adult timeline Link got carried into the child timeline that we see in the beginning of Majora's Mask. It's made mention that the royal family has kept that legend in their history, and it seems to have come all the way up until the era of Twilight Princess, where this Zora is able to know that the hero wore a blue tunic from the Zoras, just like the one in Twilight Princess is. Now at this point I want to make note that you really can't reconcile A Link to the Past, Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess all existing on the same timelines. After Ocarina of Time we see where the timeline goes from Ocarina of Time to Majora's Mask to Twilight Princess on the child timeline, and in the adult timeline it goes from Ocarina of Time to the Wind Waker. There's really no room for A Link to the Past to fit in anywhere at this point, because you just can't reconcile the stories. If you just look at where Ganon ends up after each timeline of Ocarina of Time, you see that in the adult timeline he's sealed away, he breaks from it, the world of Hyrule is flooded. On the child timeline, we see Link warns the royal family of Ganon's future plot and how that leads to his attempted execution in Twilight Princess, and then he's sealed away to the Twilight Realm, and then the rest of Twilight Princess ensues. A Link to the Past, however, is more similar to the adult timeline in that he was at least stuck in the corrupted sacred realm known as the Dark World, and then he's attempting to get out. He can't get out, so he uses Aghanim as a means to project into the light world, or Hyrule, and then the rest of A Link to the Past ensues. All three of these stories of Ganon are not compatible. It's clear that Ocarina of Time ends and clearly goes to the adult and child timelines, but there's no current way to directly connect it to A Link to the Past timeline, which I'm just going to call the original timeline, as that is the history of the original games in the series. But still, it's quite clear that Ocarina of Time was attempting to be a prequel to A Link to the Past, and so maybe we can say there's some alternate way that the stories connect. Next is the Phantom Hourglass, and this game is pretty clear that it follows up the Wind Waker. You see many callbacks to it, such as Tetra not wanting to be called Zelda, etc. After that is Spirit Tracks, and that game is also pretty clear that it's after Phantom Hourglass as well as the Wind Waker, taking place several generations later, where Tetra was known to have founded this new Hyrule, and there's other things such as Nico being an old man now. So yeah, it's pretty clear where it goes. Next is Skyward Sword, and this game is the first game in the entire series chronological order, because we see that Hyrule has not been founded, it's just called the surface, as well as the fact that the Master Sword is being forged. Demise is implied to be the progenitor of what would eventually become Ganon, or the Demon King, and that eternal cycle of Ganon being resurrected or revived or reborn in some capacity, as well as the implication that both Link and Zelda will continue to exist or perhaps be reincarnated in some capacity. The spirit of the hero will continue to go on, or the bloodline of Hylia will continue to go on, etc. Next is A Link Between Worlds, and we know that this is after both A Link to the Past as well as Link's Awakening, because we quite literally see the story of A Link to the Past being recapped. And we can also see that the game is still attempting to make some connection to Ocarina of Time, as we know Ocarina of Time was a prequel to A Link to the Past, with the sages being clearly descendants of the sages depicted in Ocarina of Time, as well as other aspects such as seeing the Chamber of Sages that was first seen in Ocarina of Time. Next is Triforce Heroes, and this isn't as explicit, but there's definitely implications that it's after A Link Between Worlds. One is the same shopkeep from A Link Between Worlds who resided in Kakariko Village, who is now in Hytopia, and he seems to recognize Link. So we can assume that this is the same Link from A Link Between Worlds, and it takes place sometime after that. Next is Breath of the Wild. Now this game is also one that doesn't have a very explicit timeline placement, but there are some implications. At the very least, it's much further in the distance in the timeline than any other game has been. The story of Ocarina of Time is recounted by the Zora in their monuments. We know that this is much further in the past than the present of Breath of the Wild, as it's noted as being beyond even 10,000 years ago. So we can know that at least Ocarina of Time happened way in the past, before almost anything else in Breath of the Wild's backstory. There are several other references to a lot of the games in the series, such as when Zelda does the ceremonial rite to inaugurate Link as being her knight and the wielder of the Master Sword. This rite makes mentions of several games, or at least implications of these games, such as Skyward Sword, Twilight Princess, The Wind Waker, and Ocarina of Time. Now at this point you may wonder, how can both of these timelines be mentioned? Because how can one story exist in another timeline if it didn't happen in that timeline? Well, that's not exactly clear, but there is implications as stated in the past, with both Twilight Princess and Majora's Mask knowing of the adult timeline story that Link carried with him when he went back in time. So it's possible that he could have carried that story into the child timeline. If the Zora monuments that speak of Ruto happens literally, then you could say it's on the adult timeline. But if you say it's the story that Link brought with him into the child timeline, then you could say that it's on the child timeline, just that story of Ruto didn't literally happen. So there's ways to reconcile it. It doesn't break the canon completely, it's just not as clear exactly how it works. It's been well over 10,000 years. It's a fantasy world with timeline splitting and stories going through different timelines. There's a lot that could have happened that can reconcile how this seemingly big issue is not really an issue at all. Next is Tears of the Kingdom, and this is quite clearly the same Hyrule as Breath of the Wild. It's noted to have taken place some years after Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild's story is routinely referenced throughout the game. It's clear that it's directly after Breath of the Wild. I also want to cover both of the Hyrule Warriors games, with the first one seemingly taking place in the child timeline, with time travel that can go back to Skyward Sword and Ocarina of Time, where the characters routinely refer to time travel as going back to a different era. Impa is noted to have heard of the previous era, and so on and so forth. Later in the Legends port of the game, there's a new storyline that connects to the Wind Waker, and that storyline is noted to be specifically a different dimension. Its terminology is different from the time travel aspects of the main game story. So this would seemingly be sometime after Twilight Princess that has time travel back to that era, Ocarina of Time's era, and Skyward Sword's era. And then later, dimensional travel has some connection to Wind Waker's timeline. Something like this could also be used to explain how Breath of the Wild can have references to all the other timelines, and we don't know exactly which one it could be, because who knows what timeline another dimension could have opened up, and some stories could have crossed over that way. Next is Age of Calamity, and this takes place in a different timeline than Breath of the Wild, although some of the characters from Breath of the Wild do time travel to this timeline, and then they're later sent back to their own era. The story is, when Zelda first awakened her power at Fort Titano, she also unintentionally awoken her guardian that she had forgotten about, Terrako. Terrako then opens a time portal and goes back sometime further in the past, and in doing so he creates a new timeline. This timeline branch plays out differently than the one seen in Breath of the Wild, with the characters now knowing explicitly when the Calamity is going to reawaken, and they have more capacity to prepare for it. Some events play out differently because of Terrako's involvement. Terrako then summons several characters from Breath of the Wild's timeline: Teba, Tulin, Riju, Herseal, Patricia, Sidon, and Yunobo. These characters are the exact same ones from Breath of the Wild's timeline, as they make several mentions of remembering fighting with Link, so that means they had to have experienced Breath of the Wild in order for them to have remembered fighting with Link. Teba wants to tell the people of his timeline his adventures here, but doesn't feel anyone's going to believe him. These characters from Breath of the Wild help the people of Age of Calamity's timeline to fight off the Calamity and save many of the people that would have died in their timeline. Afterwards, after defeating Ganon, they're sent back to their timeline. So at this point, we can take a look back at the timeline in chronological order and see that a lot of the games have a very strong connection to one another, or at the very least are clearly set before or after another game. We can see that Skyward Sword is first, and that its events will eventually lead into Ocarina of Time, which will then split into Majora's Mask, and then Twilight Princess follows that, and perhaps Hyrule Warriors will follow that. On the other timeline, we see that the Wind Waker will follow Ocarina of Time, and then Phantom Hourglass after that, and Spirit Tracks after that. And then, though we don't know exactly how this timeline of Ocarina of Time connects to the original timeline of A Link to the Past, we can see that at the very least, in some capacity, from Ocarina of Time to A Link to the Past, then Link's Awakening will follow, then A Link Between Worlds will follow, then the first two Zelda games, and it seems that the Oracle games fit best somewhere within this timeline than it would in any other timeline. And though we don't know exactly where they all fit, we do know that the Four Swords trilogy does make one single narrative, and that at the very least we know Four Swords Adventures is after Ocarina of Time. And then we also have the sort of trilogy of Breath of the Wild, Age of Calamity, and Tears of the Kingdom, which we know that it's far, far into the future, long after the other games, but it does have references to Ocarina of Time, perhaps most explicitly, with Ruto's story, as well as Nabooru being referenced a few times, and the other games are mentioned in some capacity. So we know that those games are long after the other ones. Four Swords completes some trilogy, and then all the other games are clearly one after the other, after the other, after the other. So that's pretty much what I wanted to clarify here in this video, is the fact that without any interviews, any books, nothing, just purely from the games themselves, you can still make a fairly clear timeline with, I would say, well over like 90% of the games are quite clear where they fit in the timeline. One story happens and you can see that it references another story that happened in the past, so you know that that past one happens before this one, or then you can know that this game is then later referenced in another game, and you can know that this one exists as a backstory to the later game. You can go through the timeline and see how each and every game does connect in some capacity. There is a timeline. It's just like real world history. You can look through and see that this event happened and this event happened and then this one happened. With it being a fantasy, of course, you know, there's a split timeline, so it's not exactly like our history. Like, there's many connections that I bet many people don't even know about. One such connection is originally the Master Sword in A Link to the Past was shown to be in the Lost Woods. Then later in Ocarina of Time, it's shown to be in the Temple of Time. Now, how do you reconcile why is it in the Temple of Time here versus being in the Lost Woods here? Well, of course, we know many years have passed, but Twilight Princess shows more explicitly that the Temple of Time was either moved to the Lost Woods or rebuilt over the Lost Woods, and will eventually degrade into the Lost Woods with that same pedestal that we see in A Link to the Past. And in Twilight Princess, that area is called the Sacred Grove, and we actually saw that first in Ocarina of Time. We see the Sacred Forest Meadow that's right near the Lost Woods. In the Japanese version, they have the exact same name. So Ocarina of Time actually introduced the area in which Twilight Princess would show the Master Sword and the Temple of Time would be moved to or rebuilt over. And you can see that there's a connection between all these games. If you just take the time to look through the games deeply, you will find a great many connections. And I really just wish that the Zelda fanbase would be more accepting of the fact that there is a chronological order of events. I don't really see people complaining about, like, the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit, the Silmarillion, trying to say like, oh, they're just not actually the same story. The story that we hear of Gollum in the Lord of the Rings is actually not the same one in the Hobbit. They're just separate things. There's no real timeline. Like, you don't really see people making those arguments for other stories, but for some reason in Zelda it is. I just don't quite get it. Like, I understand that Nintendo has sometimes stated that they will prioritize gameplay over story, but it doesn't really matter when the final product itself tells you the story is still there, still exists, that the lore does connect. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you have a good day or night.